Okay, so I've had a variety of different topics to cover, but I was thinking about writing this out, but I think it might be easier to just do a quick audio. Some people might question why I'm not coming out in support of this Iran regime change approach that's happening. And as a quick response, I think I even thought about maybe drawing this out and sketching it out or doing some type of visual representation of it. But I think I'll just see if I could talk my way through it. I think for the most part, it's another one of those false pretenses being sold to people. And it's just the whole framework and approach toward Iran has simply just been this strategic effort to intensify support and alliances for the way that the world dominant system seems to be trying to stay in this dominance trajectory. And it does seem to align with what we're now seeing as this U.S.-Israel alliance. And even that relationship seems questionable, where it seems in the last few years we've seen Israel and some of their leadership directly undermining the U.S., making the U.S. more vulnerable. And then making the U.S. more vulnerable in eroding their relationships with other nations and allies that should be the ones preserved because they're taking a more responsible, reasoned, cautious approach to all of these things. And there's this group of people within the present leadership administration, and not everybody, but, just in general, just kind of say a generalized summary, that seem to be the ones stoking the flames to keep this trajectory and this error occurring, where on the world stage now we're seeing other nations behaving more responsibly and helping to de-escalate what seems to be just really questionable decisions being made on the world stage. Anyway, so let me get back to this idea as pertaining to Iran. There's a lot of things that I could probably say. For one, when you've done research and studying how the dominant system, like the occupying type forces over nations, functions, we just kind of have to speak plainly about. So I've wanted to do the work to kind of differentiate between the unique aspects that should be preserved about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, other world cultures, and whatnot. But there also is this sense where this type of world system occupying force takes on a likeness of a Judeo-Christian interpretation and justification for itself. And it seems to have caused the U.S. and Israel to believe in just their own sense of power together against the other world nations, and just somehow or another aligning itself along those lines in this sense of preserving some type of dominance unto those standards, unto those types of interpretations. And so it seems like that's what we're seeing take place, and that's the approach and some of the way they geopolitically stack themselves against other world nations in this fight against this type of Judeo-Christian approach toward Islam. And not only just towards Islam, because it's other nations too. So we're seeing that take place like in Venezuela, and, they're supposed to be some type of, Christian nation as well, Christian believing nation. And so then people might say, well, why, so you're trying to say it's kind of like Judeo-Christian against Islam and whatnot. But then what about these other countries that have belief in Christianity or other what seems to be overlapping beliefs, but they're getting pushback from the U.S.-Israel alliance? And basically at some level it seems to be, to oversimplify it, because some of these other nations, there's numerous nations that would probably categorize themselves as other types of Christian nations and whatnot that are opposed to this U.S. version of alliance with Israel. and their interpretation of Christianity. And so it seems that somehow or another, they're finding that these other nations have too much of a willingness to work together, and essentially through that opposing this other interpretation of this U.S.-Israel approach on the world stage. This is kind of getting complicated. I wanted to like simplify this even more than this. What we're finding though with that approach that the world is now coming to terms with is it's been like that. People have known that. Other nations have known that the U.S.-Israel approach has had this occupying behavior toward other nations. And part of the mechanism is that when they insist on continuing to duplicate that approach and absorb the world nations and continue to return to these types of forces toward nations, it simply is to duplicate that same approach, that U.S.-Israel approach on the world stage. And other nations simply are just disagreeing that that's the accurate approach. That's a simple way to put it. Other nations of the world disagree that the U.S.-Israel approach on the world stage is inaccurate, is in error. And so when the Israel-U.S. approach to world nations keeps persisting, one of the mechanisms and the approach that it uses is it tries to destabilize nations, and it then shifts whatever the beliefs are, whether they're non-Christian, Christian, whatever the beliefs are, because we're noticing now that it's not just a type of Christian compliance; it's a type of geopolitical. It used to be framed as they're trying to convert groups to a geopolitical adherence. I mean, a Judeo-Christian adherence. But what we're finding is they're not just doing that because there are Christian nations they're warring against. They are trying to recruit nations in a Judeo-Christian approach to dominance, a certain type of dominance of Israel on the world stage, which coincides with the Temple Mount and the interpretation of Israel, and essentially a certain type of resistance against certain forms of Christianity, and just all these complications. Anyway, though, what my main point, though, was, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here, but an approach that they take against nations is they destabilize them, and they take portions of their contribution, which involves their culture, their beliefs, and all of these things. And if it is at a point of like a decent stage of negotiation, not very hostile, there's opportunity for trade and development. If they don't agree with some of the other geopolitical alignments or certain types of adherence to them, they have mechanisms and ways to inflict further destabilizing on them. And there's a lot of functions that go into this, but basically one of the mechanisms is, so they kind of take a stage of a useful sense of relational trade and potential for trade and potential for the like developing of ideas and whatnot, and they shift it into more extreme versions of it by weaponizing leverage and destabilizing efforts against them. And it is then at the point where they do some of these things that they then sell it to the other groups as this propagandized form of these nations are hostile, or they've reached a stage of hostility. We've unearthed these stages of hostility, and then it gives them justification to go in and then attack them and plunder them and all of these things. But they manufacture that. And almost every time you'll go back, when the world has been approached with these mechanisms, there's proof to go back and see where they had bypassed negotiations and other deals and other things, because they're looking to cause or to produce and enforce compliance. And so when they get to this point where they do this, and this is not to say that there are never instances where there's like organically developed clashes between various groups and whatnot, but most of the time when it has been developed in this way, you'll almost always that's a tongue twister, you will almost always find that written in the documents of history, there's a historical animosity because nations have been improperly having it imposed upon them to push them to the more extreme survival-oriented forms of their belief or religion or things like that. They then use that to justify a certain form of a type of forced conversion upon groups where it actually was never necessary to have done that. And so you find all this unresolved historical issues and animosity because of these other tactics and methods that had occurred. Then you find propaganda, of which then falsifies the stages of potential belief trade, a cultural trade, or just, mutual humanity. And then it becomes a war on selecting against beliefs and whatnot, and all just numerous things. That's not to say that eventually it doesn't heighten into actual perpetual conflicts, but then those conflicts are intensified because what these improper approaches to world nations does is it has to formulate its own, it has to create its own justification. It has to create a sense of forced type of eventual conversion. But the conversion isn't really like a spiritual conversion, because then you don't see them ever really getting to the point where they recognize spiritual mechanisms or spiritual methods. Eventually, there's nothing different about it than the way that world nations go in and create these types of authorities over and dominions over other groups. And so then eventually you find that there really isn't anything distinct about it in terms of like actual revelation of God or anything like that. But then it becomes a likeness of speaking along those terms. And then you just find that they then have to create a market in the public to sell benefits to groups of plunder. And so then you find them starting these influencer movements and whatnot, where they select and they kind of protect subsets of society as long as they agree to adhere to these forms of dominance on the world stage, and then they prop them up and platform them so that they can be those that market the benefits of these mechanisms across the world. And then they help them to like kind of sell these deals to the world as if you help us like plunder your own communities or what have you, then we'll give you all of these benefits from the dominant world market system, stuff like that. And if you don't, then we won't. And so it just turns into a lot of these questionable things along those lines, which is entirely unnecessary, becomes an improper power struggle. And so it really does become, it's basically a lie, it's a scheme to sell to the public that they really are caring about the plight that they've developed in all these nations, that they really care about them, but they really don't lift a finger to actually relieve them from the plight. They create the plight so that they can deceive the nations into thinking that they need to enforce conversion on them and save them, and that these nations are like automatically hostile. And it turns into like these same situations. And so even though for me, I don't want other nations and groups, like I recognize on the world stage that countries can be put into stressful situations where they get kind of pinned against each other, and certain forms of the media apparatus or information that they're getting also just intensify those conflicts. Even though I don't I don't celebrate the result of destabilizing countries and all of the ripple effects and things like that, and I don't want that. It is kind of likened to a manufactured situation where you want to prevent that. And to be quite honest, a lot of people have seen this coming because we've seen these patterns. And so we were out there trying to prevent this from happening, this destabilizing mechanism from being, pressed upon various people groups. We have been trying to prevent that. And once the dominant system decides to do that, they introduce those hostilities, they create that difficult situation, and they step back and pretend like they weren't the ones playing the theater to set up the deception among the people to intensify them fighting about the wrong thing. And they never come out and say, oh yeah, but like 5-10 years ago there was an opportunity to prevent this, but we saw it for what it was, meaning it could have actually prevented and created better relationships, but then we wouldn't have control. We would sacrifice our ability to use these opportunities to inflict control over the populations, and these dominant systems would rather have control through these like improper methods of approach to nations rather than the previous like years back of actual negotiation and de-escalating. And so even though I want, like in all the work that we've done, like a lot of people have done, we've been trying to prevent this very thing. But now that it's to this point, this really is like a result of the dominant system doing this and then pretending. Now they've reached the stage in the same pattern where now they're trying to pretend they're going to go in and save them. I had seen a lot of like falsification where a lot seemed put into creating this false framework, pinning groups against each other and then pretending like they're saving them. It's manufactured saviorism, and it was unnecessary, and they directly put that pressure on people to do that. The thing that is threatening to do is like if we go in and say, okay, it's gotten so bad that you've intensified this pressure, in such a tremendous way. How do we help us relieve it? And then they guard the way of like helping you relieve it by saying only through adherence to such and such in our power and da-da-da. And it's like, well, but if we concur to that, you'll just keep doing it. And so even though it's like a really difficult situation and many of us that have put so many years into trying to prevent this from happening, see it as that, it's kind of a risk that it will just increase abuse on the world stage if we say, like, okay, let's intensify the world power by adhering to how they're setting this situation up and making it look as though it's a saving mission.